Jay Sriram. Yesterday I had talked about American identity formation coming from schools and kind of influencing or inculcating this certain kind of an idea of what it means to be an American and how that was very unifying, so on and so forth, and how I thought America did a good job at that. So today I wanted to follow up by talking about basically exactly the opposite, which is the ways in which I see that American people see that their society is divided, and then also the ways in which I think the society is actually divided. And what's interesting about that is the way that I think society really is divided here is not the way that the average person is going to kind of tell you that it is. So there's basically three kinds of divisions that you're going to hear from average normie lay people who, they don't really study politics, they don't study history, they don't study politics and history of other cultures, certainly. They just kind of, they interact with people, they watch the news, they see what's going on, and they kind of just come to very superficial kinds of understandings. And there's three types of division that I see coming from these people in terms of what their mindset is. One is you have white conservatives and white liberals who think that the country is divided politically. Now, these people think, oh, the people who stand for my party and my ideology, they're the ones that are upholding the right value system, and the people on the other side, they want, if they're liberals, they want to take us forward into degeneracy, and if they're conservatives, then they want to bring us back to the Stone Age. Of course, we all know how conservatives and liberals see one another. So that's one kind of division that I see people believing exists, the political division. A second division, which I see coming mostly from blacks and Hispanics, is a racial division, that they are really wrapped up in this idea that they are oppressed, put upon minorities, that are persecuted in this majority white society. I don't really see this coming from whites. The only white people that I see this coming from are wokes, and that's a fairly recent kind of a phenomenon if you look at American history, of course. So I kind of see this as an overwhelmingly black and Hispanic kind of an issue because, of course, East Asians and Indians, because we tend to be more law-abiding, educated, and wealthier than even the average white person, don't really get wrapped up in this kind of an idea as much because it's to do with, oppression and discrimination and all these kinds of narratives. And the third kind of a division that I see people claiming, which is actually really not that political, is regional. That, people think, well, the Northeast is very different from the Midwest, which is very different from the South, which is different from the West Coast, which is different from the large swath of land in between the Midwest and the West Coast, and the Southwest is different. So people kind of saying that the states and regions in which you come from or you live in are the kind of major dividing factor in America. Now, as I touched on earlier, I don't believe that any of these three are the real divisions that exist in this society. I see basically two divisions that kind of permeate throughout the entire society. One of them is class. And I say class because America, compared to other countries, or at least compared to developing countries, there's a lot of class mobility. I mean, you have widespread access to public education. So people who apply themselves are able to rise through the ranks and, significantly better themselves through education and all of those kinds of things. And there's also a lot of entrepreneurship and things like that, right? But that doesn't really lift the masses from one class to another. That enables the kind of most studious, most diligent, most conscientious people in school to rise through the ranks, whereas the majority of people kind of mostly stay where they are. And by stay where they are, I'm not saying they stay somewhere their entire life, because what statistics show is that people do change socioeconomic ladder rungs just because of losing job or upskilling or whatever the case may be, either up or down. But largely what I see from society and my own experiences is, if you're coming from a kind of a background where your parents had college degrees, they worked in white collar jobs, and you grew up in a kind of middle to upper middle class kind of an area, you generally grow up to be that as well. And if you grew up poor in a single mother household, and your mother didn't graduate from college, or maybe didn't even graduate from high school, then you tend to grow up and be in that same kind of a class as well. And when you're a kid, you mostly make friends with people at school. And in schools, if you go to public school, you're going to school with a bunch of people that you live near, which means that they're all from basically the same class as you. Then, you go to college and you naturally feel more of an affinity to people who you feel are like you in terms of their backgrounds and life experiences, so you gravitate towards them. So again, you're socializing with people from your own class. Then you grow up into the working world and start to work, and then you're working alongside people who have, again, similar backgrounds and experiences to you. And you kind of have a situation where people who are upper middle class don't really have friends who are working class, or vice versa. And you can put other rungs of the socioeconomic ladder in there as well. And when I say class, I'm trying to talk about all of these things together. Like, what was the class that you were raised in? What kind of an education did you get? And what kind of job do you do? I'm not just saying, oh, people within this salary range are this class, because I think, at least here in America, and probably everywhere else where class is a major distinction, it counts for far more than just whatever range your salary falls into. It's almost like we only encounter working class people when they're serving us. Like, you go to a restaurant and there's going to be a waiter or waitress, or there's going to be a cashier at the store. It's not like you're actually friends with any people who do those jobs. All your friends are going to be people who, they had college degrees and they work at a desk job doing something related to their degree just like you do. That's what my friends are. That's what my parents' friends also were. It's what the people that I kind of grew up around, generally this was the kind of a background that they came from. And I think that because of the fact that it is fairly easy for the best of the best in terms of study habits and work ethic and all of that to rise through the ranks, we always kind of think, well, if someone deserves to be at a higher place in life, then they will be. So we don't think of ourselves as being a very class-divided society because of that. And we're also wrapped up in this idea that we're so significantly different from Britain, because this is kind of the foundational myth of the United States, that Britain was this, extremely hierarchical place where no one could rise up the social hierarchy, and America is this Wild West, free-for-all where anybody can do whatever they want. So I think those are basically the reasons why people are kind of resistant to this idea that class is a major dividing factor. And also you have the holdover of the Cold War and the kind of general anti-class, so-called class warfare kinds of ideas that kind of color people's thinking into thinking that class is really not a major dividing factor at all. And I think that the other major dividing factor of the two is the rural-urban divide. Now, here in America, we have an electoral college for our presidential elections, which means that instead of the popular vote, every state has a number of what are called electors. That number of votes gets put to whichever candidate wins the popular vote in that particular state. And so we have this idea of red states and blue states, and people think, oh, a red state is just Republican and conservative, a blue state is just liberal and Democrat, whereas in reality, there are no red states and blue states. Major urban areas throughout the country are all very, very Democrat and liberal, and the majority of the metro areas surrounding them, depending on how big they are, major metro areas, tend to be fairly liberal to middle of the road to slightly leaning conservative, depending on what region of the country that you're in. And then rural areas pretty much everywhere, except for in the South where they have a high black population, they tend to be extremely conservative and Republican. So that kind of even though people kind of think about regions or states as being either Democrat or Republican, it's actually this kind of urban, suburban, semi-rural slash rural kind of a divide that alters the political landscape. And also, if you meet people who were born and raised in small towns, which I'm from the state of Indiana, which is not a very populous state, and I come from a city called Fort Wayne, which had a population of about 260,000 when I moved out of there. So it's really not a big city at all. It's also not a small town. But I never really had social interactions with people who came from small towns until I went to college. And when I went to college and met a bunch of people who were from very small towns and rural backgrounds in other parts of Indiana, I was kind of struck by, one, how radically different their life experiences growing up in rural areas were, and two, the fact that 10 minutes outside of my home is farmland. And yet I had never really socialized with people coming from rural backgrounds until I was an 18-year-old in college, meeting other guys in my dorm. I think outside of college, a lot of people don't really even have these kinds of experiences where they're even starting to socialize with people coming from a totally different kind of a background too. And by totally different background, I don't mean an individual person who grew up in a small town, hated it, decided to move to a big city, and then you met them. I mean significant numbers of people that you're meeting on kind of an even playing field, like, say, a college campus. So I think that, just in closing, the two real dividing factors in America are class and the rural, suburban, urban divide. They're not race, they're not politics, and they're not region. And just as I gave some reasons for why people don't really understand that the class divide is so great, I think the reason people don't understand that the rural-urban divide is so great is because urban people, I think rural people do understand this, because rural people have all sorts of very negative stereotypes about people who come from cities, especially major cities. But I think urban people don't really understand this because they only really interact with people who are from urban areas. And so rural people are almost kind of invisible to them. Oh, these are just people that live in the farms on the side of the highway. When I'm driving from one city to another city on the interstate, I see some sparsely populated areas. That's the rural people. That's kind of what the average American who's always lived in a city kind of thinks about rural people, at least from what I've seen. And the fact that you can easily move wherever you want in the United States also kind of lessens this idea that, well, if you can just move from a rural area to a city or a city to a rural area, how big of a dividing factor can it really be, right? Which kind of goes back to the class idea that, well, if you can change your class, how big of a division can it really be? So anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about today. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Jai Shri Ram.